So let me start. I'm Jacek Gębal. I'm a software engineer, primarily databases. Doing engineering since around 2000, so over 20 years now. And I'm infected with testing for several years now. So I'm all about testing and automation and continuous delivery. You know, all these buzzwords around agile, that's my world. I'm also co-author and maintainer of utpsql version 3, which is database unit testing framework for Oracle. Now, I'll close with that. Maybe Jasmin, you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Jasmin. I'm also working as a database developer in consulting. I teach software engineering and also testing practices at the university here in Switzerland. And during my work, I also focus on testing and how to test data marts and data warehouses. So I give the word to Sabine.
Yes, hello. My name is Sabine Heimsath. I live in the Frankfurt area, where I'm also working as a consultant for over 20 years now. Yes, mostly developing with PLSQL, and always been envious of Java developers and their great unit testing frameworks. I discovered something like utpsql once, which was the old version. It didn't stick. But nowadays, we've got the new utpsql, and I'm still introducing it in our project and convincing colleagues to do proper testing with it. And yes, let's see how it went. Next one, Philipp.
Okay, my name is Philipp Salvisberg. I'm also a developer and mainly in a database field, but I do a lot of stuff lately also with Java, more stuff with Java than with PLSQL. And how I'm related to utpsql, it's 3 years ago, Jacek asked me if I know someone who could help develop a SQL developer extension for utpsql. And since then, I'm the one who maintains this stuff. This can happen, and I learned a lot about utpsql, and that it is in fact a very good framework. So yes, that's it. So last but not least, Sam.
Hello, my name is Samuel, and I'm a senior software developer in a very small company in southern Germany, in the Black Forest. And I used to be a Java developer, and nowadays are doing mainly PLSQL. And so I really wanted to keep those testing things, but in fact, I really started using tests to support my development, writing PLSQL and not Java. And so it's a little bit the other way around than you would assume it was. And I'm also working in my spare time on the utpsql framework, mainly the command line interface, the Java API, and from time to time, a little bit in the core too.
Okay, thank you all for a brief introduction. The topic for today's discussion is it works, but it hasn't been tested. So what does it really mean that it works, right? If it hasn't been tested, right? How do you know that? Philipp?
You can't know it. If it hasn't been tested or hasn't been executed somehow, you don't know it. So you maybe have compiled it, you maybe have somehow executed it, but you can't know it without some kind of test. And in the end, you want to know if it does what you expect, and if it just runs, it's probably not enough. So what do you think, Sabine?
I'm just thinking of a situation we had last week when my colleague handed me a pull request and said, yeah, it works. And I've run it. I said, okay, good. And when I looked into the code, I said, well, this was obviously copy paste and there was still the old table names in it. So of course it compiled and it also did something, but not completely and not all of it. So it works wasn't defined at all. So we were talking about different things, obviously. When he said it works, he meant, well, it ran without exception or whatever. But I thought, well, it was ready, really tested. So having a test which someone else can execute is much more helpful than the sentence, it works. So you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so when you think about it works, right, you probably want to define the boundaries of like, what does it mean that it works? Like, where does it start? Where does it end? What does it really, or what it is supposed to do? Like the functionality that you're writing, right? So I guess it's really good idea to write down those, those maybe bullet points, like it should do this, it should do that, right? Like when I'm finished, this is how it should work.
I wonder what means it isn't tested, really, because in my experience, most developers test. We developers, we issue a select statement to check something. Maybe we open some application to check something. Maybe we use DBM as output to check something. That's testing. And in fact, using automated tests you can run is just a little bit of a different technique. And maybe it's not even the best for all situations. I really wonder, Jasmin, do you always write automated tests for your data mart testing and stuff?
Yes, most times. I try to do the automated tests because everything that I can do on my machine manually cannot be reproduced on anyone's machine in a safe way. I'm not sure if the thing that I write is tested the same way as I would have tested it. Without an automated test, I just cannot assure this.
Yeah,
That's
I think
why,
that sorry, Jasmin.
Sorry, yeah, that's why I prefer the automated tests over executing something manually.
It reminds me of the old days, like before I learned about automating tests or like writing tests that are actually executable, is the amount of wasted effort. Like when I was testing things manually, whether it's through DBMS output or like, writing SQL statements after running my procedures, and that was repeated over and over again. And then, at some point, when I was forced to work on a piece of code for long enough, I would kind of automate it. Like I would write a script, right, to see if actually, what I've changed works as I expected, because, writing the same SQL 100 times doesn't make sense, right? So that was kind of poor man's test automation, you might say, because I was scripting some of the steps that I wanted to check, but it wasn't really transportable because those were my scripts, right? I knew how to execute them, and they were very much contextual for that one thing that I was doing. And the next time I would be coding, writing some different functionality, I would kind of go through that process again and maybe write new scripts in a different way, or if someone else would be doing it, they would do it totally differently.
I see in the chat we have actually 2 questions, and also someone seems to be a little bit disappointed how the topic of this panel discussion is. I don't think that we will present something concrete, because it's not in our scope for today.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Like the topic is more theoretical, to maybe talk about the challenges and like what does it really mean, and how how did we come through the testing of the databases. So we will share our own experiences as we go through this panel discussion. And feel free to ask questions if there is anything urging you. I see actually 2 questions. So maybe I'll go with the first one. There is a different company who takes care of testing and we only do development. Could you advise if we have to put that much time in testing? And that's from Amit.
I would like to give an answer to that because I work for a very small company. So all time I am investing is directly billed. So I need to be very careful not to waste time with testing. So I feel a little bit home in that question. The real question is what is testing in that way? Because I'm pretty sure that your testing company or your testing department expects working code from you because that's your job as a developer. So you have a bunch of different possibilities to assure that. You can check manually, you can code defensively with all kind of assertions and stuff, or you can use automated self-tests. And I don't talk about end-to-end tests in that way, but really tests that help you as a developer to create working code, because that's what your output should be. Does that answer the question a little bit? So the answer is it depends. But in the end, you are responsible to create working code.
Yeah, I think that's the end goal. Like, I've been in different companies. Some of them did self-testing. Some of them actually had a separate QA department where testing was totally separate from development. But regardless of what you do, at the end of the day, the customer should be satisfied, and you should have, you should be convinced that what you are delivering is quality software.
In my opinion, even if you have a testing department, or if you are doing testing in another team than the developers team, it's still the developer's job to provide the unit tests, because that's kind of part of the whole development process, because you know what you are developing, and even if you have a department to count on that they will test the whole functionality of your application, it's still your job to build this safety net that you can guarantee that your functionality works as designed.
I guess that is a good point, because when you develop code, you just don't develop it, compile it, and you're done at a certain point. And that's my way, how I develop. I write code at a certain point. I want to see if it does what I thought it does, and I want to check it. So I try to execute that piece of code. It might be a script, it may be a select statement, and recently I'm using much more unit tests to find out if it does what I want. And the cool thing with the unit test suite, it's that I don't know who said it, because when you execute the code and you have to repeat it, and you have to run that script again, and you have to change something, and if you have a unit test which you just can run again, then it's much more simpler, and you're much more satisfied or sure that you've done what you wanted to do with your development code, with a piece of code. So it's probably a different focus when you are developing. You want to find out if that piece of code does that. So it compiles and it checks a certain functionality. And if a testing department looks at the code, they will look at the broader things. I think that's a different view. But I fully agree. You cannot separate development from testing, because you at a certain point you want to execute it, and you have to. And testing framework nowadays helps a lot, even in database development. And I guess we have some questions there. How does that work? Huh?
Yeah, the questions are flowing like long list already. So I'll actually move to the next one, which is I'll skip one for a moment. So how can we start to use it? And I guess that's from Cyprian, and I think it's more like, how can we start to use testing or test automation? And there is another yeah, maybe let's go with that. What is the easiest way to approach testing in PL/SQL?
Find the inputs and the outputs. And if you've done that, you already did a huge part of what is necessary to get your code tested. And I think it's not very easy in the database, to be honest, because we have a lot of indirect input, which is called state.
But
yeah,
you have the advantage to, you can look into the code.
Yeah.
It's not guessing.
I think that the biggest advantage of being a software developer is actually you're developing that code. And right, what you said, Sam, as inputs and outputs is indirect. I actually call it side effects, or like some of them call them side effects, right? So you have like those explicit inputs, like parameters to your PL/SQL, right? And explicit outputs, which are again out parameters or like function return call. And that's like from object-oriented or any other programming language, that's, you might think, oh, that's my input and output. But in databases, that is merely maybe a parameter, a switch to say how it should be done. But then what's happening inside is all the data in the tables that are this input, and the data in the tables, that is the output. And I think that's the hardest part of database testing.
Yes, for example, you could test a view, and you don't have explicit input there if you, let's say, query everything from that view. So you have the input is something completely different, but you want to check if the columns are correctly calculated, aggregated, and so on and so on. And the setup behind this view is hard work.
There is something going on in the chat, and I just tried to read some of the things. Some people are disappointed that we have a pretty shallow discussion. I will try. We will try to make it more deep. And Cyprian asks, does the test imply data? So my question is, does your functionality imply data? And if your functionality uses data, then of course data is part of your test too. And that's probably the most difficult thing when it comes to automated testing in the database.
Yeah, the way I approach testing PL/SQL code is starting with what you said, Sam, identifying all the inputs and all the outputs, or like, but maybe let me step back. When I first started to do automated testing for PL/SQL, it wasn't a greenfield project. It wasn't a brand new product. I started by joining a company, and we already had like working software, which was like a massive product running in production. And there were a few engineers that were in the project for 5 years. And me and my colleague joined as new engineers. And in our company, we said, well, we want to introduce automated testing. So we were new to the project. We had no idea about the business domain. We had very low understanding of the code base. And we were asked to do like a change in the code, add a new functionality. And the first thing we did, we said, okay, let's identify first what that code is doing, because how can we change it safely if we don't know what it's doing? So I'll be honest, like writing your first test for existing functionality, it's going to be hard because most probably your the first functionality, the existing functionality is doing a lot, maybe too much in one procedure. So you probably want to write kind of an acceptance test, the test that will say, yeah, it works or it does what it does. And then you want to maybe add another test to say, well, now what I've changed also works, right? And that way you can test that your functionality works. And by testing, I mean maybe writing a data comparison on the tables that were affected by running your code. So you really want to check the data in the tables after the procedure was executed to see how is the data affected by my procedure. And is this the what I want?
Okay, I see we have some questions around that data stuff, because also Alexandru's question goes in the same direction. I just read it to the audience. I find it difficult to test PLSQL that has side effects in multiple tables. Usually just a cleanup afterwards, especially when relying on dictionaries with foreign keys. Do you have any suggestions on how to implement testing in applications that haven't been TDD'd? Oh, there's lots of questions in this one. And Cyprian also points out that we often have different environments. And for example, in a banking system, we don't have the same data in production as we have in dev and test. So maybe we can answer these questions together because I think they are somewhat correlated.
In my opinion, if you have automated tests, you also need your set of test data inside your tests. Because if you don't have that and rely on external data that is not connected with your unit tests, you just don't know what you're getting. You cannot precisely test, for example, boundary conditions. And that's why it's so important to combine the unit tests with the test data to just get reliable results over and over again.
Yeah, in fact, if you don't have static data or like predefined data, you really cannot expect a specific outcome. Right? So when you run your tests on some data, you're actually hoping to get the outcome because you actually implicitly assume that the data is what it should be. So someone comes in, changes the data in your dev environment, or you get like a refresh from production, whatever, and your tests start to fail, and you're in big mess really, because all of your tests are broken. And that's not the point. They shouldn't be broken because your preconditions have changed.
Yes, that it's especially important that you have a set of test data that is very diverse. You want to have positive tests and also negative tests. So also test data that cannot be applied to your application and will fail if you call functions with it or procedures. And you want to test those boundary conditions. So what's working and what's not working. And if you do this, the assurance of your stuff working in production with your production data is just a lot higher.
Maybe we need to point out that if we are talking about input, we don't talk about parameters.
Yes.
Because that's everyone that starts with testing reads examples about, hey, you need to control your parameters and then you need to check the result. We have a different situation in the database because our input is the result of select statements, is some data in the tables. These are our inputs. These are, in fact, our parameters, and we need to control them. And that makes it so hard because there are oftentimes many inputs, much more than if we would have parameters in functions. And the same goes for the output. Our output isn't the return value of a function. Our output is, for example, the existence of a specific column or a specific row in some table or in some tables.
So when I think about testing, I really think about testing the behaviors, right? And I think the unit testing as a name got really very overloaded in last years, and there are very extreme ideas about what a unit test should be or what it shouldn't be, right? For example, people are saying, unit test should never interact with the database, but we're actually talking about database unit testing, right? And depending on the source, right? And I just say, well, unit is just a name, right? So I will say unit testing and I know what I mean. Maybe it's not exactly what others might think it is. And some sources say that in unit testing, the unit is the test itself. And it means like the test should be testing just one thing, one behavior, and the test should be isolated from other tests. So it doesn't really matter if I'm running one test on a database or I'm running 2000 tests. That test shouldn't be affected by other tests. So there should be no correlation between the tests. And in that way, the test is a unit. And I'm talking also about behavioral unit testing, because you really don't want to test your code, because at the end of the day, you will realize, well, the code is doing what the code is doing. And it's kind of, if you're just documenting what the code is doing by your tests, that it's not the best way to think about it. You really want to test what is the requirement that this code is satisfying. What is the behavior that the code is performing? Like it's inserting 100 rows into employees table. That's a behavior. It's deleting data from some other table. That's also a behavior. So there might be different behaviors in your code, and you want to look at, when you're thinking about tests, think about testing the behavior of your code. But I think there is another part of that question, Sam, that will be kind of skipped. There's usually just the cleanup afterwards, especially when relying on dictionaries with foreign keys. I think there is, this question implies also, how do we deal with cleanup of the data that we generate in the testing?
Yes, ideally, we could avoid a commit in the end, and the cleanup would be a rollback. So that would be very, very helpful to simplify the cleanup. But when we have legacy code where commits are happening, then this is the pain, and we have to find out what this code really does to find out how to do the proper cleanup in the end. And that's so not that simple.
Just to clarify, if we don't have if we don't have commits or implicit commits or rollbacks, utpsql will roll back everything on its own. So maybe that wasn't clear. So if you're using transactional stuff without commit and rollback, utpsql will take care for any cleanup that is necessary.
And actually, that I find it very helpful, because it's not just about your input data that you do set up in your test. It also affects all of the side effects of your procedure. So if your procedure is not doing transaction control, it's really easy to not worry about, well, there is this data, like this procedure, I don't know exactly what it's doing. It might have changed 5 other tables, and there is a trigger on one of the tables that could do God knows what. But as long as there is no commit or rollback in your code, when you run the test against that stored procedure, all of the data gets cleaned up, which is very helpful. And I found it very useful in where I'm using utpsql, because instead of having 200 lines of code to clean up the data after the test, I just don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, that's
okay. We
very
have
true.
a follow-up you have a follow-up question? But just go on. Yeah. Okay.
Actually, that cleanup thing was something very, very helpful recently when I had to build up a test which had 10 tables input. Sam, you remember that package, I guess. And the cleanup, if there had been a commit, would have been the same amount of code probably. But there's a very good question in the in the Q&A. What about sequences? For one test case, I had a sequence which counted down for my own test data. So I started from -1 and counted down. But what if the test code actually produces new rows with sequence numbers? Then they are burned. So if anyone has an idea about that problem, that would be really cool.
I have an idea. Like, why do you bother? Like, why does it matter that your sequences are incrementing on dev environment or test environment? Like, hopefully you're not running
some Java class which expects IDs that are, well, 9 digits long, but can't be longer. Then you don't want to waste any IDs for testing.
And then you have to deal with in the cleanup code with it. So you have to save the value and reset it at the end. And that's really a pain. So the question is, if it doesn't matter, it's just a number, then go with it. And if it really is a problem, then you have to deal with it. Like every other data. For example, if you have some code which does autonomous transactions, then they write some log entries. And if you want to clean up them afterwards, you have to deal with them, even if you do an automatic rollback afterwards. So it really depends. And that's the thing which is hard in the database to deal with that. But there are strategies that you look at just one behavior, and maybe also another idea is that you have your downsized version of your application with your domain tables set up and with some sample customers, which some boundary values where you have set up, which you maintain there, which is your test data, and you don't have to, every single test case has to set up them from scratch. So there are strategies, but all the strategies are in the end not simple, it's hard work. But at a certain point, you have to do it. Either you do it automatically, or you do it manually, or you don't do it and wait until the customer or the user is doing it. Someone will do it. And if you cannot live with the pain that the customer calls, then you have to do more. And automatic testing helps you there. That's it. It's not the silver bullet. It's still hard work, but it's really cool, and it has a lot of features. From one of my favorite features in utpsql is that you are able to compare cursors. This is just wow. It's just wow. You have to use it, and you think, why I haven't used that framework not before. If you just start using it with a single use case, you will get some value. But just start small. That's it. There was a question, how do you start? Install the framework, step 1, and write your first test, a small one with some value, where you really have something to do, not just try out where you have to develop something. Try it out with your first test, and you will learn a lot. And ask questions if you think you're doing it wrong, or there must be a simpler way. So that's my recommendation to start.
So there are 2 more questions that I'm kind of not going in order. I'm very sorry for that. Cyprian was asking if utpsql is used in Oracle EBS, which is e-business suite, I guess. The answer that I can give you, like, I didn't use it in EBS, but we had users asking questions about running utpsql, and my internet is broken, I think.
Maybe I can answer that one question, because I know the guy who asked questions about using utpsql with EBS. As far as I know, he's still doing it, but in a slightly different way, which is mainly because the compilation time to get the actual tests was really long, but we fixed that with the new database trigger approach to get the information about the test suites. So it should be a lot easier today to use utpsql with EBS. I hope that was what you was referring to, Jacek.
Yes, I think that the key problem with EBS is that it has like thousands and thousands of packages in one schema, right? And
over 30,000, I think.
Yes, that's a lot. And our solution, like suggestion, was to write keep the test packages in a different schema. But if that's not suitable, you can go with test packages in EBS schema, but use the latest version of utpsql with database trigger approach. That way, the startup time for the testing should be very quick. And do we create objects for testing? If you're asking about object types, when I'm writing my tests, I do sometimes, but it's more depends on the implementation. I think my internet is pretty bad now.
We have one person in the utpsql community which came up with a pretty cool approach to deal with data setup and tear down, or mainly setup using objects in the database. I think, Philipp, you looked into that a little bit with Matthew Butler. You are muted.
Yes. Matthew did a very good job in writing a prototype which is based on object types, where you say, yeah, I'd like to have a person with a name, and then I have to have an address with the second address and something like that. So you just write small piecelets of code to set up your data. But these object types are currently manually created. So it's a lot of work to invest, but it helps you to set up, for example, static data much simpler. And that's a good approach. I think it would be at a certain point also a possibility to generate part of it based on a proper data structure. But we haven't found someone to have time to invest in that area. But I know of customer who did a similar approach, where they had just this empty database with set up some static data and helper packages to create these objects to simplify the unit tests. And that's a working solution. That this is not just an idea; it's just something which could be improved and makes development of tests much simpler. So have a look at Matthew Butler's GitHub repository. It should be linked. I can send a link. I can look it up and send it in the chat. So it's really worth to look at that idea. Yeah.
If it's not linked on the utpsql resources page, it should definitely be. So I will check that.
Does it need an empty database, or did I misunderstand you, Philipp?
No, it does not need an empty database. So it's just your strategy. From my point of view, I don't know a single customer who really works with a completely empty database. You've set up something which is static, but it's what did not work. And I agree with Jasmin in that area that you use production data for that. Even if you do some kind of profiling where you're looking for production data with that criteria and do the tests based on that, at a certain point you get errors and you have to look it up, and all the work is just in the future. instead of having it right now. And the other disadvantage is that if you work with a large set of data, the tests run longer than necessary. Of course, you have some, at a certain point, performance tests, but really when you are going to develop, you want to have tests which runs fast, and 5 minutes is not fast.
So speaking about performance, who does performance tests using utpsql or any other tool maybe?
No, so far I'm only doing unit tests. I've never done performance tests on PL/SQL code so far. I sometimes do migration tests, but only if I do larger migration just to check up if everything worked fine or worked as planned, but I haven't done any performance tests.
I can admit that I have some performance tests in a way that I know if a certain statement needs more than a really high amount of time, let's say 2 seconds, for example, for a primary key select, then something is terribly wrong. So I really use that kind of tests only as a change or problem detection. I had long discussions with Jacek about that because he thinks that utpsql is definitely not the right tool for that job.
Well, can you test against some expectation value, or how would you do that?
Yeah, of course. I can store my current timestamp, then select from a select statement, and then compare my then current timestamp against the previous timestamp, and set my threshold with between or something.
Yeah, you know, Oracle has a lot of instrumentation to do performance tuning and performance testing built in already. For PL/SQL, there is, you know, profiler, and actually there are 2 types of profilers you can use. For SQL, there is tons of stuff, right? You know, you can do active session monitoring, you know, active session history, you know, explain plans, DBMS monitor, and most importantly, right? You know, maybe your development environment isn't the one to do performance testing, because it could be a totally different environment with totally different data volumes and also different data distribution. So in production, you know, you might have 2 tables, and one could be 10 billion rows and the other one could be 1,000 rows. In dev, the proportion will be different, not only the size. And so all of your execution plans, all of your performance tuning in that environment is a throwaway if you don't go and check the performance on the right environment. I wouldn't use utpsql for performance testing, really.
Why not? Because it's not,
well, unless
you've got so many other things or for testing.
I think it's not written for that. It's basically some kind of database unit which is executed, and it doesn't provide functionality to support you in that area. Technically, you could do that. You could run a big job and look at it and just compare the times, some other highly aggregated data, and do the comparison on a higher level with some tolerance. I guess we have also some comparison with tolerance options, but in the end, it's not really optimal. Technically, you can do it, but it's probably not what you really want.
There is one other question I would like to address, which is utpsql more suitable for a service-oriented architecture than for a monolithical? And maybe I'm understanding the question wrong, but for me, the biggest problem for monolithical applications is that they have lots and lots of dependencies. And dependencies are what makes testing very, very hard. And the dependency in the database is, for example, a constraint. So let me make a small example. You want to test creation of a customer. And to test that, you need the country of the customer, you need the zip code of the customer, you need the address of the customer, you maybe need the credit card of the customer and the institute for the credit card, and so on. So we have lots and lots of dependencies, and that is really a big pain if you want to test, because you need to deal with all these dependencies. So from my point of view, you have two possibilities. One thing is you script all these dependencies, which often gets very messy, or you change the way that you write your database code in. And the funny thing is that we had the same problem in application development too, maybe 20 years ago. There is this story from the original Quake shooter game, which was basically one parent class and every other class inherited from that class. And that was the way how games and how programs were written back 20 years ago. And probably we are at a similar situation now in the database development, that we need to rethink how we implement our database code. Not to have so many dependencies, to reduce necessary constraints, to reduce necessary dependencies.
We have someone that raised his hand. Shall I open the mic?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not?
Okay. So, Ciprian, you ask question, you raise the hand, please talk. Can you hear us,
Yeah,
Ciprian?
Hello?
Yes, yes. We can hear you. You have raised
Do you
your
hear me?
hand. Okay.
I guess we stop here and ask the questions in the question boxes. I think
Yes,
it's easier.
yes, yeah, probably yes.
There is one question that wasn't answered for a long time. What are all the types of testing you use when it comes to development code and in relation to databases? I'm not sure how do you define types of testing. You know, there are so many ways to classify types of testing. You might say, we already talked about performance testing, right? We could say like, you know, data quality testing. We could do, you know, penetration testing, regression testing. And if you ask someone, there will be, you know, 50 different answers depending on who you ask about the types of testing. So I really don't know if any of you folks has a good answer to that question.
I was thinking about it before and only came up with, I do unit tests, and maybe on how you define it, doing integration tests of larger modules. Yeah, it depends on which level you are testing, but it stops probably then.
Approval tests are also something you can very easily do with utpsql, which is basically have cursor comparison. You have some scripted or in any way predefined result set, and you get that into a cursor, and then you can match any cursor against that golden test, or how it's called. So that would be
if you have
type.
if you have a set of data that you want to compare those
Yes.
kind of stuff, yes, exactly.
Yes, you have a golden test or a golden set of data which you compare against. So you don't exactly know what all the tiny little functionality is behind, but you have an overall picture.
And this is very useful if you're modifying an existing code. So you may capture the behavior now, like how it works before you start doing the changes. You may save it as a database table, right? Or save that data set of the existing working software of that procedure. And then when you change it, right, you might say, now I know what should be modified and what shouldn't be changed, and you can compare the data before the change and after the change in the code. And that's a really nice way of doing, like starting with testing, especially when you're dealing with larger code base that you're not familiar with.
I'm not so happy with what Sam said before, because we are a panel and let's go and fight a little bit. And you said because the dependencies are a problem. In my point of view, you have the dependencies anyway. With when the use case has these dependencies, then you have it. It's just a matter of how you are going to model it, if they are really constraints in the database, and what it needs to successfully commit some set of data. And so from my point of view, there are just different approaches. And what I faced a lot in the applications we wrote is that we have complex data models, and you have to fill, let's say, 5, 6 tables together to have a consistent state. And usually there are a lot of entries you have to make that consistent. And if you think about the user is going to enter this data, he never will do that in one go. So you will have some intermediate states where you say, I'm going to save that, but it's not really complete. And then you work with some state of that object, or of group of object, where you say in the end, now I've entered everything and it should complete. And then the final set of constraints will kick off. And it's a matter of modeling. And from my point of view, you always have these dependencies, whether you have really enabled constraints or not. And in the database, when we store everything in a single database, we have some advantages of enabling those constraints. That's the point. And I wouldn't go with the way to disable the constraints, or say, have we intermediate states where we can commit it and say it's not yet there where it should be. And then of course you have to deal with some additional nullable columns which are in the end not nullable. That's the price you pay. But that's another way to deal with that dependencies, which worked well in my opinion.
I assume that you maybe have more major data models, because what I have seen is really situations where you have so many constraints and real dependencies. And a dependency can also be some select from a bunch of different tables inside a procedure, which is inside a procedure, which is inside another procedure. And I totally agree that if you have some state that belongs together and that needs to be together, that's absolutely something you should provide. But my observation is that you have lots of state put together, at least in my cases, which aren't necessary. For example, if you have a customer and you have a prename and surname, you don't really need their address for a lot of cases. But from my experience, that's a very simplistic example. But I saw a lot of databases where it was mandatory to always have all the stuff, and that makes testing a real pain, especially if we don't talk about 5 or 6 tables, but more so 12, 20, 25, each with 30 fields.
The way I approached that in the past, when I had these kind of data dependencies, is not really to try to get rid of them, because as Philipp said, like there is value in having those, enforcement of the constraints in the data model, right? And like I see the database constraints as the last stand in your data quality. Like, that's the last bastion. If you remove the constraints, then there is nothing to really stop someone from messing your data, right? So it's good to have them, but then this is like at the same time a big challenge when it comes to testing, because like, you want a banana, then you get a banana and you need to get the monkey and the jungle, right? So you need to take all that stuff in just to test, like, is the banana yellow or not, right? Or is it green, right? So you don't want to do that, right? What you want to do is like, well, okay, well, if there is a banana to test, right, I'll probably, pretend there is a monkey and the jungle behind the banana, right? So there is, like, the way I used to do it is, okay, I know that there are 20 tables, right, that I need to set up, but do I really care what's the data in those 20 tables? Maybe I can just choose a random value that's already there, or if there is no record, like so I'm trying to identify the scope of what is needed for my procedure to function properly. And of course there are dependencies, like, but it's not relevant dependencies from this point of view of that procedure. So it's really good to understand what's the scope and point of view of your procedure. What is the lens, the landscape that the procedure sees, and the rest is just dependencies. So you say, well, okay, I need to fill them in somehow, but it doesn't really matter if it's real data, fake data, irrelevant data, because it will not affect the behavior of my procedure. There is one more question. Does utpsql has also inspecting code features? Well, we have code coverage. We don't really have code inspection as such. When you think about sonar analysis, like static code analysis, right? There is sonar, and there is one thing that Philipp is working on as well, which is an alternative solution for that.
It's a PLSQL cop. It's also a Sonar plugin. In the end, it's a static code analysis. So no, PLSQL, utpsql doesn't have that. Yes.
So Sabine, like, what do you see as the hardest thing in testing database from your experience?
Well, actually cutting the units right, identifying which unit to test. And so you don't, well, do too much unnecessary things, but really test the right things. Because that's not something you can, well, find with a checklist or so. It's always a matter of intuition and experience. So yeah, I would say that's the hardest for me, at least.
And Jasmin?
For me, it's covering the most with the fewest tests. I don't like to write many tests, but I want to cover a lot of possibilities with the fewest possible tests to write, so that I can, lazy writing tests, but still covering lots of possibilities. And finding this balance, I think, is the hardest.
So how many tests to write, right?
Yes, how many tests to write for a given functionality?
We didn't even talk about it, but it's a very interesting topic, really. How many tests is enough for my procedure, right? And like, if you're doing micro tests, like your very, very small tests that are very targeted, that those tests will be small. You will probably write them pretty quickly, but then you will end up with hundreds of them, right?
Yes, exactly. And you don't want that.
Yeah.
Well, I do. I do.
You just want to show off.
It's you don't want that, Jasmin, not that I don't want that. It depends, I think. Like, if you have like 100 columns table, do you want to write 5 tests for each column? So that would be like 500 tests just because you have a 100 column table. Probably not. Yeah.
The problem I see, and therefore I agree with Jasmin, is if I have a lot of tests, I have to maintain them. And if I am going to change something significantly there, I say, my goodness, why I haven't written that many tests there. And there are a lot of detailed tests which I needed during development. And at a certain point later on, I think I don't need all of them, or I don't think all of them are equally important, something like that. And that makes it a bit difficult. You create a lot of code base you have to maintain. And at a certain point, it's the test base which gives you the headaches.
I don't mind deleting tests, to be honest. I was hesitant a while ago, but I really trying to be okay with actually deleting tests rigorously. If I don't need them anymore, I just delete them because they.
How
do you
end
a meeting today to talk about deleting tests? Really?
When I think about deleting tests, I'm doing some changes and get funky results there, and they what the heck are these tests doing? I don't understand the text. My comment I don't understand. They are just not the expected results. And deciding quickly if I can delete these tests, it's not that easy for me. So the problem is probably a bit earlier, where with the strategy how to start writing maintainable tests, and I'm not there yet.
Well, that's the hardest question for me too. So how do you write good, maintainable, valuable tests? I don't think you ever have learned enough in that matter, as well as how do you write good, maintainable, valuable code. It's just the same.
I think it's exactly as you said. It's the same as you look at your code. Like as your coding skills grow, your skills to grow, like to write tests, will probably grow if you're writing tests. So the more you practice, the better the testing. Like even if I look at our journey with utpsql, we started off with some self-testing. So our utpsql has also a lot of utpsql tests to test utpsql functionality, which is very curious and interesting. We have like 800 tests, and sometimes when I'm modifying some functionality, I'm getting annoyed because the tests are getting broken, even though like I didn't change something that should break the tests, or I'm changing this and some totally different test is broken, right? And well, those tests are correct in a sense, like they actually do the testing. It's just that it's really sometimes hard to draw a line, like how much do you want to test or how little you want to test, and that's a hard balance to find. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you have confidence in your tests. You want to make sure that, well, I have those tests and I know that if they are not broken, my software works and I'm confident about it. It's not like, yeah, well, I give it to QA and let them worry about it, or we'll give it to the customer and maybe he will find some bugs, right? It's like, I'm proud that I have written this code, it works, and I know it works. It's not, I think it works. I think that's the biggest value for me for writing those automated tests. And I know we're 9 minutes over time, so I think we probably should be finishing. So thanks everyone for attending, and it was great discussion, and we had quite a few great questions, and I see that the chat was quite active, even though we didn't really, well, I didn't manage to follow it all. But if you have any further questions or follow-ups, I'm not sure, Mirella, can we share some form of contact, or maybe you can reach out to us on our utpsql Slack channel, or if you're using utpsql, ask a question directly there. And Jasmin, Sabine, I don't know if you want to share some contact details for Q&A later on. You can probably find us all on Twitter, right?
Yes, you can find us all on Twitter, yeah.